New Year's Eve in Genoa City wasn't just a date on a calendar. It felt like a thin, trembling line between what people had endured for far too long and what they were finally forced to admit. For Tessa, that line was drawn by Mariah's prolonged silence, by the feeling of being left behind in a room filled with memories, but missing the breath of the person she once called home, and by the fear that if she kept standing still, her life would harden into a permanent posture of waiting for something that might never return intact. Tessa had tried to be patient. She had tried to be sensible in the way adults are supposed to be, telling herself Mariah needed time, telling herself distance could be a kind of healing, telling herself that if love was deep enough it would be strong enough to wait. But the closer the new year came, the more those arguments felt like thin paper shredded by cold wind. Because every time Tessa watched other people move forward, she realized she was turning herself into a shadow of who she used to be, simply because she was afraid to choose. Daniel stepped into that emptiness not as a plan but as life's reflex when it sees someone cracking, while still pretending they're fine. He didn't enter Tessa's story like a man trying to replace someone. He entered it with the patience of someone who understands what it means to be stranded in feelings, with no exit. He noticed the way Tessa smiled to disguise pain, the way she restrained herself so she wouldn't become anyone's burden, the way she feared asking for too much and therefore chose silence first. The more Daniel observed, the more he understood that what was exhausting Tessa wasn't only Mariah's absence. It was the daily, grinding sensation of having to convince herself she was still loved without any proof to confirm it. And that was the point where Daniel got pulled into responsibility, not the heavy kind of duty, but the human impulse to become a real shelter for someone standing in a storm with no idea where the shore is. Tessa didn't walk toward Daniel immediately. The truth is, she fought it inside herself, because she understood how dangerous it is to reach for someone just to fill a gap. She feared being seen as a traitor. She feared hating herself if Mariah returned, and she had to face those eyes. But at the same time, another fear lived even deeper, the fear that if Mariah never returned, or returned no longer as the Mariah she once knew, then Tessa's life would become an endless chain of waiting, and everything she ever wanted for herself would slowly die inside that delay. The first fear made her keep her distance. The second fear forced her to ask a question she could no longer avoid. What is love, really? If it demands she sacrifice her right to live? And then, in the exact moment when everything felt compressed beyond what she could carry, Tessa finally said the truth she had been swallowing for too long. She needed to feel loved, not through vague promises, not through pity disguised as kindness, but through a presence real enough that she would no longer feel like she was living in a house without foundations. For Tessa, those words weren't an easy invitation. They were a boundary, a condition for survival. She had been pushed away for so long that she understood this clearly. If she stepped into another bond where she had to guess whether the other person was truly there, she would not make it. That's why, before she allowed herself to go further with Daniel, she needed to know he didn't see her as a temporary option, didn't see her as something to occupy an empty season, and didn't see her feelings as something that could be ignored whenever it became inconvenient. Daniel heard that not as pressure but as something raw and real. He knew exactly how deeply Mariah's distance had wounded Tessa, not because Mariah was cruel, but because withdrawal has its own particular violence. Being shut out isn't only being left behind. It forces you to doubt your worth. Am I worth staying for? Am I worth explaining things to? Am I worth loving in a clear, steady way? Daniel had seen injuries like that in others and in himself, and he understood that for Tessa, love was no longer a simple romantic idea. Love was safety. Love was being seen. Love was not being shoved to the margins just because someone else was battling their own darkness. Daniel didn't want her to repeat the same pattern, so he didn't try to persuade her with sweetness. He met her with certainty. That night, right before the new year, Tessa decided she could not postpone her life anymore. That decision wasn't a careless impulse. It was the result of too many days spent tearing herself apart, punishing herself, balancing loyalty against the need to stay alive. When Tessa allowed herself to explore what she felt for Daniel, she wasn't only opening her heart to a man. She was admitting she had the right to exist as a whole person, not as a shadow waiting for someone to return. They kissed, and then they went further, like water held back too long, finally finding a path. But the heat of that moment didn't feel reckless. It felt like release mixed with fear, like craving love right now, while still haunted by the question of what tomorrow would demand. After that night, Daniel would make a promise to Tessa. The promise didn't need to sound like some grand vow. Because its weight came from something specific, Daniel knew how much it had destroyed Tessa. To be shut out by Mariah. So he could swear he would never push her aside or lock her out of what was happening between them. It was a promise of clarity, of not forcing Tessa to guess, not forcing her to wait in silence, not punishing her with distance whenever he was struggling. For Daniel, it was also self-binding. If he stepped into Tessa's life this way, he could not turn it into another blurry story that hurt her all over again. For Tessa, the promise didn't instantly bring peace, but it gave her what she had been missing for too long, something solid enough to breathe against. Tessa said she didn't regret it. If you listen quickly, it might sound like stubbornness, like someone trying to prove she was right, but it was really the confession of someone who had hit the bottom of loneliness and finally understood that regret can be just another way of punishing yourself in order to preserve an image of being good in other people's eyes. Tessa didn't regret it because she didn't do it to retaliate against Mariah. She didn't do it to erase Mariah. She didn't do it to rewrite the past. She did it because she had tried hard enough, held on long enough, hurt long enough. And if someone is exhausted to the point of asking herself every day whether she is still lovable, then choosing one moment of being loved, being touched, being seen isn't a sin. It's survival. But even as Tessa told herself she didn't regret it, the question returned like a cold hook catching in her chest. What does this mean for the future of Tessa and Daniel? And the future here wasn't only about whether they could become a couple. It was about how Tessa would live with this choice if Mariah came back. Because the most frightening thing wasn't simply that Tessa and Daniel had crossed a line. The most frightening thing was that Genoa City has a habit of throwing people into the worst possible timing. If Mariah suddenly returned, how would Tessa face the eyes of the person who once felt like her whole world? Where would Daniel stand in that room, new love, loyal friend, or living proof of a decision Tessa would be forced to explain? And more than anything, what state would Mariah return in? What mind, what fracture, what shadow clinging to her? That's why this story can't remain only about Tessa and Daniel. Because alongside Tessa's choice, a darker reality has been settling over Mariah like poisoned fog. The last time Tessa tried to reach out and wish Mariah a happy holiday, she received a strange message. It didn't have to be long. It didn't have to be openly threatening. But its strangeness was enough to chill Tessa's blood, because it felt as if it came from a place no longer fully belonging to the Mariah she once knew. Tessa couldn't explain it logically, but her instincts understood something was off, as if the person sending it was standing behind glass, watching life, no longer able to touch it normally. Mariah had been discharged from the psychiatric hospital. That information, instead of bringing relief, sounded like an alarm. Discharge doesn't mean danger is gone, especially when the greatest danger isn't outside at all, but inside a mind that can't always tell what is real. And then, like a piece that made the picture even worse, a photo appeared in an episode showing Mariah staring into a mirror. Ian Ward was staring back at her. That single image was enough to turn everything into an ongoing nightmare. Because a mirror is where a person is supposed to find herself. Yet for Mariah, it became a place where someone else took her seat. Ian didn't need to stand there in flesh and blood to do damage. If he existed as hallucination, as the ghost of manipulation, he could still bend the way Mariah saw the world, saw herself, and saw the people who loved her. Now that Mariah was out of the hospital, the fear of what Ian's hallucinations might urge her to do sharpened into something unbearable. In the hospital, there was at least structure, layers of control, observation, intervention. But in real life, especially in the first days of a new year when everyone is distracted by celebrations and resolutions, someone like Mariah can slip quietly into danger before anyone notices. Ian in the mirror is the symbol of invasion, proof the past refuses to die and always tries to resurrect itself in the weakest moments. If that hallucination starts whispering that Mariah needs no one, that Tessa betrayed her, that the world deserves punishment, how long can Mariah resist while she is still so fragile? And this is where the tragedy tightens. Tessa's choice and Mariah's instability aren't two separate lines. They are two wires slowly sparking toward each other. Tessa can tell herself she deserves happiness. Daniel can tell himself his promise will heal everything. But reality doesn't run on self-persuasion. Reality runs on collisions in messages arriving at the wrong moment, on reflections in the wrong place, on a return that forces every promise to prove itself. Deep down, Tessa cannot truly settle, because she knows Mariah isn't simply an ex or a chapter she can close. Mariah is part of her identity in Genoa City, part of a life she built with full faith. When Tessa says she doesn't regret it, she's telling the truth about her present. But she also knows the future might demand payment and guilt even if she doesn't deserve it. Because if Mariah returns in danger, or if Mariah does something under Ian's influence, Tessa will inevitably ask herself whether she abandoned Mariah at the exact moment Mariah needed her most. And that question could eat her alive until every bit of joy becomes conditional. Daniel can't escape his own inner war either. His promise to Tessa is sincere, but sincerity can become weight when everything turns into a storm he can't control. He wants to be the man who never pushes Tessa aside. But he understands something painful sometimes when the past returns like a darkness with teeth. The present love gets dragged into a battle it didn't create. Daniel might stand firm against gossip and judgment. But can he stand firm against the truth that the woman he's falling for is still bound to an unfinished bond? And beneath all of it, Daniel's deepest fear might not be Mariah returning to take Tessa, but Mariah returning shattered enough to pull both Tessa and Daniel into danger. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, Mariah is walking between two worlds. One world where she tries to believe she's okay, believes she's out, believes she can return to normal. And another world where the mirror reflects Ian, where the past still speaks with a voice that sounds terrifyingly familiar. When a person looks into the mirror and sees an enemy staring back, it isn't only hallucination. It's the collapse of identity. And once identity collapses, decisions can become extreme, emotions can distort, and every connection can transform into either betrayal or threat. So the tension suffocates not because of one shock, but because it locks for names into a structure with no easy exit. Tessa wants to live. Daniel wants to protect, Mariah wants to come back, and Ian wants to infect everything like poison. The new year is supposed to be the time people believe in beginnings, but for them it feels like a door opening straight into an old room full of shadows. Everything beautiful about that night takes on a blurry edge, because everyone senses that the morning after could demand consequences. Tessa can repeat to herself that she doesn't need permission to be happy, but every time her phone vibrates, every time the memory of that strange text returns, her heart tightens. That message isn't just a line of words. It's a sign that Mariah exists somewhere out of reach and that the distance between them isn't just silence. Daniel can hold Tessa's hand, can make promises, can try to become her anchor, but he cannot erase the fact that Mariah still exists like an unclosed door. And behind that door is a mirror where Ian still stands watching. And once New Year's night passes, once everything should calm down, the story doesn't calm down at all. It simply shifts from the noise of one heated moment to the tension of the aftershock. Tessa looks at herself and knows her choice is real, her feelings are real. But she also knows Genoa City never lets choices exist without fallout. Daniel feels his promise is the most honest thing he can offer, yet he also feels a faint, ominous instinct that he has just stepped into a war whose rules he didn't write. And Mariah, somewhere out there, carries her mirror, carries Ian's shadow, carries a mind that has left the hospital but may not have left the abyss. The hook is hidden in the smallest thing, that strange text message. If last time it only made Tessa uneasy, the next one could become the first sign of Mariah's next spiral, or the knock of the past at the exact moment Tessa finally believes she had the right to begin again. And as Tessa stares at her phone screen, she realizes the most terrifying part isn't what the message says. It's the feeling that it might come from Mariah Hoare. It might come from wherever Ian now lives inside Mariah's mind. In that instant, Daniel's promise, Tessa's claim of no regret, and everyone's hope that Mariah is truly better after discharge, all hangs suspended on one thin thread, one more vibration. And that thread could snap, leaving the real question not where Tessa and Daniel go from here, but what kind of Mariah will come through the door first, and who will be staring back from the mirror when she does. In the first days of the new year in Genoa City, the air doesn't feel like a beginning. It feels like a cold film stretched over every decision the Newman family makes. Victor has always operated from the position of control, always treated conflict like a chessboard where he can move pieces at will. And yet he is forced to swallow a truth he hates. There are moments when power is not enough to make everything go according to plan, especially when the risk is sitting inside his own family. That is why Victor pauses his targeting of Jack Abbott. Not because his hostility has softened or because he has suddenly grown generous, but because he understands that the threat in front of him is more dangerous than any war of pride. When someone like Matt enters the Newman orbit, every old feud becomes secondary, because one small mistake no longer costs shares, contracts, or psychological leverage. It costs blood and irreversible loss. Victor stares at the situation like a man who has lived long enough to recognize what danger really is. Matt is no longer a problem that can be solved with intimidation or negotiation. Matt is an unstable variable capable of switching directions on a whim. And that instability makes ordinary strategy feel useless. Victor refuses to show any crack of panic, but inside him, Worry has already hardened into something cold or ruthless resolve. He pushes Jack to the side not because Jack has become unimportant, but because Victor cannot fight two wars at once when the other war involves the safety of his own. The moment Victor accepts that, Genoa City tightens like a thin wire, one sharp tug from Matt, and everything snaps. Nick, standing at the center of this storm, carries a different kind of pressure of being a son, a father, and the one who has to get his hands dirty to keep the family alive. He cannot watch Victor walk into the line of fire alone, and he cannot lie to himself that everything will be fine if they just wait for Matt to make a mistake. Nick understands that waiting is a luxury when the opponent can strike at any second. And when Noah's life has been dragged onto the table as a threatened target, hesitation becomes its own form of guilt. That is why Nick chooses the most dangerous route that still looks like it might work. He has made a deal with a criminal. It isn't the decision of a man trying to play hero. It is the decision of a man who accepts being stained if it means saving someone he loves. But that choice splits him in two. If the plan works, he protects his family. If it fails, he becomes the one who opened the door for disaster to walk straight into the Newman house. Victor and Nick build a trap together, and the most frightening part isn't how clever the trap is. It's what they both understand about it. The trap only works if Matt still believes he controls the game. Victor needs Matt to walk into it on his own. He needs Matt to be so confident he becomes careless, to believe the tightening wires around his throat are nothing more than harmless thread. Nick understands another layer. The trap isn't only aimed at Matt. It is aimed at the fear already living inside the Newman family, fear that they cannot protect Noah. The fear that they are about to be dragged into a brutal vortex. They cannot escape without sacrificing something. And the question hangs there like a blade, will the traps Victor and Nick set actually destroy Matt? Or are they merely buying time before Matt strikes back in an even bloodier way? The truth about Matt is that the problem isn't his strength. The problem is that he is no longer bound by ordinary logic. Victor can read greed. He can predict the next move of men who want money or power. But Matt is the kind of man who will burn everything down just to prove no one can control him. That is why every deal is temporary. Every promise can be ripped apart the second Matt senses an opening. It's why Victor cannot rely on Nick's negotiation alone. And why Nick cannot breathe easy even after the trap is set. When someone has stepped to the edge of cruelty, the only thing that can slow them down is sometimes the thrill of causing fear. And Matt is feeding on that thrill. Inside that tightening tension, Detective Annie Stewart becomes a link that is both necessary and dangerous. She stands between law and shadow. And she is also the one hearing directly from Matt, a man who doesn't bother to hide how unstable he is. When Matt tells Annie he may not keep his promise, it is more than a casual refusal of a deal. It is a declaration that he is willing to smash any structure others try to build to contain him. Annie understands the weight of that statement. It sounds like metal scraping inside a gun barrel before the trigger is pulled. And Annie senses something even worse if Matt is saying this to her. He wants a witness to his betrayal. He wants to plant helplessness. He wants to turn Annie into the messenger who delivers fear into the Newman home. The threat to kill Noah Newman is where everything crosses a line and stops being an issue to manage. It becomes a point of no return. If that line is crossed, Victor will have no choice but to respond with the ruthlessness that made his name. But that is the cruel paradox. Victor wants to protect his family. Yet he knows if he retaliates purely on instinct, he could endanger Nick and Noah even more. Victor doesn't fear war. He fears war igniting while his family is still in the line of fire. Nick is haunted by another quiet guilt. He has tried to reduce risk, has made a deal with a criminal to carve out an exit. But that very deal may be encouraging Matt to feel even freer to break out, encouraging him to prove no one can corner him. Meanwhile, Noah becomes the symbol of what Victor and Nick refuse to say aloud. The Newmans can win hundreds of battles in a lifetime, but if they lose once in a way like this, they will never recover as the same family again. That is why Victor and Nick's trap isn't just a plan to catch Matt. It becomes a test of family cohesion, a fight between control and chaos, between strategy and a killer's impulse. Victor forces himself to focus, forces himself to shove Jack aside like a war that can be fought later. Because right now he needs absolute clarity. Nick forces himself to believe he can go through with this, without being corrupted beyond recognition. Annie forces herself to keep the cold logic of a detective, even while standing too close to a man who wants to turn everything into a life or death game. And Matmet is a spark searching for gasoline, searching for more fear to feed the sick feeling of power he craves. As the moment of action draws closer, the city grows quiet in a way that feels wrong, as if Genoa City itself is holding its breath. That silence isn't peace. It's the empty space before impact. Victor looks at Nick like an ally he never wanted to need, proud that Nick will do what is hard, terrified that Nick may be pulled into the darkness of his own choice. Nick, even while trying to appear steady, can't erase the image of Noah as a target simply because Matt wants to prove something to the world. Annie, hovering at the edge of the trap, knows that if Matt changes his mind in a single second, every contingency collapses like a building built on sand. And Matt doesn't even need to do much. By staying ambiguous, by letting betrayal hang in the air, by keeping the threat over Noah's head, he already makes a powerful family tremble with every breath. In the end, the real horror isn't whether Matt keeps his promise. It's that Victor and Nick both understand this. A man like Matt will only keep a promise if it serves Hyman. What serves him can change with every impulse. That is why they cannot soothe themselves with the belief that they've secured control. They are only racing time, trying to tighten the trap before Matt can twist free. And just when they believe every link is finally in place, just when Victor allows himself the smallest thought that he has temporarily shielded his family from the blade, something colder drops like breaking glass. Annie has received a signal from Matt that he no longer considers the deal binding, and the threat against Noah is no longer a line meant to scare. It is a decision being activated. Nick turns to rush forward with the instinct of a father, and Victor stands still for a rare, frozen second, as if he has just realized the trap they built might slam shut in the one way they never imagined. And the real question heading into the next episode isn't how Matt will be taken down, but where Noah is at the exact moment Matt decides he is done keeping promises. On our TV Spoilers channel, I'm always looking for content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.